Hello, hello. Alright, then we're back to Braid. There's going to be a lot of commentary coming up. Well, it's probably not for everybody, but I like it. It's maybe a bit too. It could have been more snappier in terms of pace. Like if John Blow recorded it by himself and scripted it, it could have been like way faster. But like he decided to do it in a form of conversation, which also like brings a bit more to the table, because like if you're doing it alone, you're not exposed to like some other questions that people might think of. So I don't know. It's a question, and my cat demands attention. Amongst. I'm all covered in wires. Alright, where did we stop? I think Chris Moore was like a dead end. Pretty sure. Yeah, I feel like you get here somehow else. You need to like find the door somewhere. Probably. Then we got Casey.
So it wasn't like the first time you read Calvin.
Yeah.
It would be neat to do thinking it would be cool to make a game like this sometime.
No, not
it
at
was
all.
it was actually much closer to the actual time of making Braid that you first started thinking like, hey,
Yeah.
it would be neat to do something like that, those books that I read.
Yeah, and specifically what I was thinking was, well, you know, in a story,
Like it's basically
you can
like a
just
podcast.
sort of postulate whatever the laws of physics are. Like, okay, the moon comes really close and it pulls the ground up and stuff, right? Doesn't exactly work that way in a game, especially like the more systemic the game is, the more you kind of can't just cheat that sort of thing. You have to more make a system that exhibits those properties. And
Right.
that to me is more magical.
Right.
Right. I was like, there's something cool, and if it's hard, it seems very hard, but if you can do it, it's a little bit more groundbreaking than just doing a story about the thing, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
In the field of games, it's a thing that very few people had done. Now, there were other games that did analogies of this sort, right? So
Okay.
one of the earliest ones was Rod Humble's game, The Marriage, which I had shown at EGW, which
Right.
like
I
there's two
listened to
people in this
this.
relationship and they're just colored squares on the screen,
Right,
and
right.
you move them around and some stuff happens, and
Right.
you know, and then Jason Rohrer actually had done these two games, Passage and Gravitation. I think they also in the situation that the game's about, right?
Right.
It's not just the plot and the fiction that the game is about, but the rules of the universe that are being set up are expressive of what the game is about. And so I wanted to do something like that. And I wanted to do it about physics because, you know, quantum mechanics, for example, is pretty weird. Things in a fiction kind, and just like seeing what happens until.
Yeah, I listened to
But
this.
then, so there's this mailing list conversation that happens. There was some discussion that probably started with Prince of Persia: Sands of Time had come out or something.
Yes.
And so you guys were talking about rewind in games. And I, to my recollection, maybe I contributed to this conversation a little bit, but I was not really one of the people with the strongest opinions in it. But there was a lot of conversation about like, did this game do a good job? And then what does rewind ability mean for games going forward? Right. And what I remember you saying was, this is obviously a technological feature like rewind was for VCRs.
Yeah.
So it should just be in most or all games as something that you can just do.
Right.
But it's like other people were like, well, you can't do that because you're removing consequence from games. right?
Yes.
And consequence is important. And like the conversation kind of went back and forth on that for a bit, but I was like, nobody really implemented anything, right?
Right.
And so then I was on vacation and I was thinking about this physics thing. Being able to rewind maps onto this bidirectional time thing that I was thinking about. It's sort
Yeah.
of the same idea from a different perspective, right?
Right.
And so I kind of been wanting to make this Calvino Lightman inspired game. So I started to have an idea like, okay, this is actionable. If I actually program rewind,
Right.
then it's both contributing to that discussion
Right.
because with an implementation, but also answering this question of like, what can I do about this physics game that's actionable? Now, even at that time, I didn't think the whole game would be rewind. It was just like,
Right.
here's some manifestation of one of the lines of the game. And I did, because Invisible Cities is many different cities and whatnot,
Right,
I was
right.
thinking it would be a lot of different worlds.
Right.
And one of them would be the rewind world, but
Right.
like another one was like the quantum superposition world or something.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yes.
Another way to phrase the thing that you were saying is like, look, this is really fundamental. It should just be there. It shouldn't be like a weird game design gimmick. Like for people who don't know Prince of Persia Sands of Time, which I'm sure
Right.
most people these days don't, it had sand that you would use to rewind
Yes.
time, and you had a certain number of charges. And when you ran out of rewind charges, which you could pick up,
Yeah,
on
I know of
then
this
you start
game, but
losing lives when you
haven't
die,
played it.
right?
And also, for people whose main like touch point for this is playing Braid, when we say rewind, we don't really mean Braid rewind. It was like a really crappy like 10 seconds of rewind tops or something.
And
Like,
it was not a technically good, like the sound didn't go backwards.
and the animations
and
were all screwed up,
yeah.
and it was very limited, so you could not like rewind all the way back to to the beginning of a long level or anything like that.
No. It was like they had some ring buffer with character
Yeah.
positions in it,
Yeah.
and then they made the rest up or something.
Yeah, it
right?
was and it was
But it was also,
not
like,
really the kind of gameplay
3D,
thing that
yeah.
it is in Braid,
It's
where
probably
it's
way
expected
harder
to
to
always
do.
work and always go all the way back and all that stuff.
But so also with the story stuff, it's like you read some words about time or something, what's going on with this character or that character, before you experience the gameplay, right? And so you don't really even know what to connect to. But after you finish the world, if you were interested enough to go back and read it some more, you then have both halves of the thing and you could maybe see correspondences, right?
Right.
And then similarly, there's structural parallelism between the worlds and stuff, and just things about them that you could notice. Like, on the one hand, I expect a great many people would just walk past the story things and not care about them very
Not
much.
even read them potentially.
And
yeah.
that's why it's designed the way it is, as opposed to the original thing. Because in the original thing, where it puts it on the screen and it's like, the point of this screen is only for you to read this text and then press spacebar to continue, you almost have to disrespect the game a little bit to not read the text. You know what I mean? Like if I'm playing a modern game and like I'm mashing the button through all the dialogue scenes that I don't
Yes.
care about, I'm kind of disrespecting the game,
Yes.
but I have to in order to get to the part that I want to play, right?
Yes.
So here it's a little bit of a middle ground there where, you do have to walk across the room and you incidentally walk past these pages, but like the function of the room is also just to be the playable menu that contains
Right. The linking
doors.
room. Yeah.
And so it's not only the text, and so you kind of don't have to totally disrespect the game. If I were to redesign Braid now, which I'm not going to do for this anniversary edition, but like I might even make it like right now it's still a little bit passive aggressive, or that's not the right word. It's a little bit closer to the original thing in that the story text is always between you and the doors. And I
Right.
might mix that up a little bit,
Right.
right? There's an analog dial of how strongly am I suggesting that maybe you want to read the text, right? And it's in the middle somewhere.
I mean, there's you could imagine a design that went very far in that direction, where it's like the house itself contains all of the linking and the text somehow, so that you literally never go to a screen that is just about having text there as the main thing that's in it, right?
Yeah.
You know.
There's just some other things too, like the ratio of Okay, so you go onto the cloud screen, right? And the title of that world is big letters at the top and always visible. Like you don't have to even go to a podium. So aside from the doors, the function of the cloud screen, just the fact that it's the cloud screen again, the first time, of course, you don't know what it is, but the second time and thereafter, it established a pattern.
Yeah.
So you get that. You get the title, which is a hint about what's coming
Mm-hmm.
and sort of tells you what this world is called. And that's there before you even go to a podium, right? And so when you go to the podium and the story text comes up, it's like, okay, maybe you're interested and maybe you're not, but those other things already provided some value or interest as well, right? And so it's just this balancing act. I might make it a little bit differently today even, but it's okay. You know, I feel good about that. I mean, it's the first puzzle game that I ever designed.
Yeah.
First single player game I ever designed. So, you know.
So, you know.
So I didn't want it to be like a story-based game in the way lots of games are, where it's about the narrative or something. Those
Right.
people drove me nuts,
Right.
like even back then.
Right.
But I like the idea. Okay, so it's some kind of hybrid. I want to have some writing and I want to have some gameplay. What does that look like? Well, you know, there are illustrated storybooks,
Right.
some of which are for kids, but even
Right.
for like young adults and adults,
Mhm.
the further back in time you go, the more you see like things that are illustrated, right? And
Right.
then even old religious texts were often
Right.
just like
Yes.
illustrated, right?
Yes.
Here's Jesus dragging the cross or whatever.
Yeah.
Like that's a thing.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, what if it's like that, an illustrated storybook, but it's kind of flipped around where the text takes the place of the illustration in that there's like less of it and it's there more for color and flavor. And then the gameplay is like the text in the storybook is the main part, right? Is most of what you're experiencing and playing most of the time. I don't know. Also, ergonomically, though, if there's going to be text as an introduction, like I liked it better as an introduction in the beginning of each world to
Yeah.
help set it up than like coming in the middle or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
Now, if I were text phobic, sometimes people do things that are inherently contradictory, right? They do that all the time.
Okay.
If I wanted text in the game but was scared of text in the game,
Yeah.
I would put it as little blurbs in the middle,
Right.
Or have
Right.
little characters who would tell you backstory.
Right.
Like before I even started Braid, I think a very popular indie game was like Cave Story, right?
Right.
And it was one of these like linear story-based adventures where you meet characters and they have dialogue that gives you information about the world. So that was very clearly a model that I could have done.
Yes.
But I liked, so
But then
I wanted
you'll
this to
have
be
to
an art
skip
game, right?
Right.
That was another one.
that
of
if
the
you don't want
there were
to.
a lot of high-level parameters of what I was trying to do,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
I wanted it to be an art game, but unapologetically an art game, right? Because I'd been thinking about art games and experimental games and all this stuff, and I was seeing that certain classes of things were not being made.
All right. Well, I'm pretty satisfied with how it's presented, I guess. There's still like more that could have been done, but yeah, it's good.
A different example of a pattern break that's a lot more subtle in this game is, well, the epilogue that you get to at the end, right? Even the final level before the epilogue is pretty different from what else happens in the game.
Right.
That acts as a break and also just like that you
What?
get to at the end, right? Even a different example of a pattern break that's a lot more subtle in this game is, well, the epilogue that you get to at the end, right? Even the final level before the epilogue is pretty different from what else happens in the game.
Right.
That acts as a break and also just like a dramatic, it makes it feel like a heightened moment that it's so different from the rest of the game.
Yes.
But then in the epilogue, I straight up break rules that were constant through the rest of the game. For example, like obstacles look a certain way. They have high frequency details and are well defined and all that. And then in the epilogue, you can just like walk behind stuff
Okay.
all of a sudden, right?
Okay.
And I don't know that that's something that players will consciously get, but it's
Yeah.
different from what's happening, right?
Okay.
There is
It
stuff
didn't
to
really
play
strike
in the
me that-
epilogue.
hard.
involving the story, right, and game mechanical items, which heretofore have never been in the same place at the same time, right? So that's like a pattern disruption or a convolution of what had been established already. The thing that you do for those or what you get for interacting with them is a different class of thing, right? And again, I don't want to go too much into it, but it's different. So I'm breaking the pattern established by the game up to that point, but I'm not in danger of disrupting the game because this is a tiny part at the end, right?
Yeah, it's such a small thing. Didn't even think about it.
I don't think this idea was there from the very beginning, but at some point I had some idea that like I was going to have a little bit of a shock surprise ending because like Mario games are kind of for kids and are infantilizing and all of these things.
Okay.
And if you like go very mature or whatever at the end, that would be a way to, I don't know, be surprising and show that it's an art. Like, look, who would do something like this in a video game?
Right. Like they cook the man for dinner at the end
Yes.
of the movie or whatever. It's like
yeah.
now you're pretty sure this isn't for kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that had been the premise for a while, and there were versions of the story that did that for a while. And the thing is, I just decided eventually that like isn't that good of an idea, right?
Okay.
It's just like I don't like I want to do something better than that. That is a relatively, how would I say it? Like if you're looking around and you're saying there's all this kid stuff, and so I'm going to do something that's not kid stuff, that's still a thing that someone who isn't totally an adult would be concerned with. Because if
Okay.
you are an adult, it's no big deal.
Okay.
You know, you go online and you get insulted by people all the time, and you
Yeah.
can tell who they are by what
Yeah.
they do.
Right.
So like once in a while, people say to me like, you know, I say something that they don't like, and they're like, oh my God, you're so immature. This is
Right.
ridiculous. And I'm like, wait, how old do you think I am? Because I'm not worried about being immature right now.
Right. Yeah.
That's just not a thing that's on the table for me. But because you think it is, you're probably in your 20s or something, right? And I just know this, right? And so it's kind of like that. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I'm going to have this game not be totally kid stuff, and I'm going to do an adult-ish thing. And that just seemed a little bit childish at some point. And I think I knew it was the whole time, and I just didn't have a better idea.
Interesting.
So, for example,
Yeah, like in the Nathan For You episode, there was a moment where he gathered like a bunch of kids in the meeting room and presented them with like some weird like circular toys. Then like started asking if they want to have them, but nobody really wanted. So he started pitching it as like every adult must have this toy. Like you're not an adult if you don't have it, and like things like that. In this way, and eventually the kids like wanted that toy. So like it's the thing for people who didn't grow up yet to want to look older, and I think it's like very similar to what John Blow is trying to say.
so
But I don't think it's like disappears at any point, not completely. Still there always.
So, for example, The Witness is a pretty damn adult game.
Yeah.
Like, I can't really think of something that's more of a game for adults than that.
Okay.
I wonder if
Aside
A
from like
kid
a
could
very long going
pass.
Sudoku game or something.
Right.
Right.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But it isn't that way because of anything gimmicky. It's
But
just
sure they
the
can.
sensibility, right?
right?
And so the problem was my conception of how this thing would end was a little bit gimmicky because it had a little bit of like M. Night Shyamalan to it that was not helpful.
I don't think I ever
What?
saw this twist ending
Okay.
you're talking about. Maybe.
The point being
Okay.
though, I had some plan of what the arc was.
Okay.
And then eventually I decided that's not a good arc.
Okay.
I am disappointed with this arc. And so I'm going to do something that I am less disappointed in.
Mm-hmm.
It is also going to be less comprehensible to most people.
But
But you know what? I'm just
Less
going to do
comprehensible.
what I want to
it's
do.
my game, my
Yes.
my rules.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened there. And I was very aware while doing it that it's going to be even less linear conceptually. It's going to be even harder to read as a conventional story. And I didn't care. I was just
Okay.
like, look, this is what I want to do.
I still can't fucking get the story. I have so many options to choose from. Who this princess is, what the story is about, but like nothing ever fits well.
How did that idea develop that there was going to be sort of distinct two things, text and the game?
It was baked into the idea at the start
Okay.
for reasons, right? One, I kind of wanted to write something again. I had written things way in the past, and I was like, I could do something here.
Right.
It was going to be much more of a constrained writing exercise.
Okay.
So part of all of this stuff, so the Olipo, which we mentioned,
yes.
is all about constrained writing according to rules or
Yes.
heuristics or algorithms, right?
Right.
And then, like, these specific books that I was taking inspiration from were like that.
Right.
And so I kind of liked the idea of there's gameplay in the different worlds, and that puts constraints on what the writing is. That's one direction of constraints.
Mhm.
And then there's an orthogonal direction that's just from writing to writing. Like, the intros to these different worlds can have structural parallelism in some way.
I
In the
see.
end, there was probably at least one too many constraints on it, and it, like, the writing quality suffered from it
Okay.
probably, but you know, it's fine. But like, I was just interested in that idea. And
Is
then
there like
also,
pi coded
even
into
before I know
the
it's
text?
rewind, there's this idea that doing something in gameplay is more difficult than in fiction, because in fiction you can just just depends on how good you are at rhetoric in some sense.
Right.
Like, once there was a world where
Right.
everybody walked around on their hands,
Right.
and that's just how it is.
Right.
And in games you have to deal with what that means.
Right. Yeah.
And walking on their hands is not that good of an idea, but like, you open a door and it goes to another universe or whatever. Like, that's an idea where in fiction you can say whatever, but you're describing some rules all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And in games, you have to make those work consistently for it to be a certain class of game, a system-oriented game. Now, of course,
Right.
whenever I say this, there's always like, well, it could be like the old adventure games where there's just if statements, right?
Right. So you don't really implement
Yeah.
the system. You just implement the like particular beats you cared about, and everything else is just not there.
Yeah, but even those are better when they feel systemy, and
Yes.
the way that people figure out. So, like Planetfall, for example,
Yes.
or Starcross actually is even
Yeah.
more.
So much old
Starcross
games
has
you're
some
referencing. I
objects
have
that are pretty
no idea.
systemy. And the way that you
IBM.
solve the puzzles is you know how they behave,
Yes.
and you use that to engineer the solution.
Yep.
And then the if statements happen to correctly implement the behavior that you wanted,
Right.
right? And so it's like you're pretending the system is there, both as the player and the author, right? But as you go more forward in time and games are more capable, it's like, hey, there's more of an actual system,
Right.
and the system is more complex and nuanced. And I was
Yes.
very interested in that.
You know, I don't know Jonathan Blow's view on the story games, but I also like story games a lot. I like a good story. But I also like the systematic approach too. Like, it's they're both could be great if executed well. I feel like, yeah, it's just different genres, but one is not better than the other.
When you first start designing this game, you went on vacation and you found that like one thing kind of led to another, and very quickly it built out to something approximating worlds 2, 3, and 4. You even have the text in there, not the final text, but text that's like sort of similar.
Well, and the text is, we could clarify, it's in a different form than you see it in the final game, right? In the final game, it's in a somewhat interactive screen where you run by some books on podiums and it changes the text between stuff. Back then, it was more like the minimal thing you would have to put text into the game. So there would be before each level just a screen that's, you know, not in the game. It's just a different mode. And it's like press spacebar to start the level or whatever, but there's a bunch of text. And in general, it was, you know, all the text for that world on the screen. So it was like a bigger text dump and you couldn't really go back and read it if you skipped it. And all these things that you would expect from a relatively short amount of effort on a game.
So the text in Braid is something that was revised a bunch of times. The actual last time I played Braid before its release, it had substantially different text than the text that was actually released. So it was getting revised a bunch of times.
Like through development.
Throughout the development.
For sure.
And during the course of this interview, you actually said you think the text maybe wasn't as good as it could have been because, quote unquote, you were trying too hard to make it good, actually. You said that. I don't know what you mean by that. So maybe you could unpack some of that. How did you develop the text? Like, what were you sort of trying to do there? And what did you mean when you said maybe you tried too hard or something? I don't know. I really don't know what you meant. So
there's just a problem that happens if... Okay, so to relate this back to design, broadly speaking, right? One of the best skills as a game designer is to know what something looks like as somebody who just sees it for the first time. Where are their eyes being drawn? What do they think about all these things, right?
You did mention that multiple times.
It's a little bit similar with writing, probably, except I have not clocked nearly as many hours writing as I have designing games. And so there's this thing that can happen if you're really thinking hard about how to make writing do a lot of things functionally. And like, how do I do this with it? How do I do that to it? How do I connect it to this other part? How do I make it short enough, but also still have some idea in it? And two things happen. One is, unless you do a really good job refreshing yourself, you really early on stop seeing it as somebody does when they see it for the first time. And this becomes very hard. So you just see like little tweaky things about it and whatever, right? And that for sure happened.
Okay.
If I make a game, I know that what people see first helps set their expectations of what the whole thing is about. When it came to the text in Braid, because I was so looking at it up close, I probably failed to account for certain things. So for example, the World 2 text is the first text that people see. And because it's first, it sets expectations thematically for what the game is about and what the point of things are and stuff. Whereas that's actually, you know, I revised that one a bunch, probably too much. And to me, I was more setting it up parallel to the other worlds because that's the structure of the game, right? And not correctly accounting for the degree to which the first thing sets the tone. And to be honest, the World 2 text is my least favorite. It's the one that I think is like the lowest quality and the one that I was never as happy with. And so to date, I haven't revised any of the text for the anniversary edition, but if I did, it would probably be the World 2 text, both for this functional reason and for the fact that like I never was totally happy with it. And some of this unhappiness came from, you know, like when you're writing, being as brief as you can while doing the thing that you're trying to do is generally good advice, right?
Yes.
I think that in some cases, I was trying to be a little bit too brief while trying to do too many things.
I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is like he's also trying to conceal the meaning while also trying to write shorter. Though, again, if that's by design, I don't know, like, what disappoints him exactly is the question. Just the quality of rhetoric, like, I'm not sure. I wish he actually tried to explain what it means, but we'll probably never going to hear that.
And what that manifests as is you read something and it just seems weird, or like it doesn't totally connect. Because if I'd added another half of a sentence or there or whatever,
Right.
it would have made more sense. But I cut that half of a sentence because I was very worried about the thing being too long. So like
It removes
actually,
some of the color, like it becomes more stilted if it's super compact.
yeah. And in fact, that's what happened with my game developer articles is they came unreadable because they were forced
Right.
to fit within a certain footprint. And I
Right.
think to a little bit of an extent that happened here, especially with things like the World 2 text and
Okay.
whatnot. So if I were to give myself writing advice back at that time, it would be to not be so worried. Like, look, if people are going to read these at all, it's because they have an attention span.
And the people who don't are just going to run by them anyway.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
don't worry that much about optimizing
I
the
don't know.
length.
Mm-hmm.
Because then especially like weird stuff
No, it's
happens,
still
right?
it's
So,
still
for
better
example,
to optimize.
if you're trying to write and you're trying to be concise and clear, one of the things that you would do that's, most people will give you this writing advice is to cut superfluous like adjectives and adverbs,
Right.
because even though they seem to you to be helping set the tone and stuff, they weigh something
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and it becomes clumsy if you just have a lot of them, right? And they take it longer to get to the point that you're actually getting
Right,
to,
yeah.
right? The problem is as you try to make things short, like if I want to cut out an entire sentence that would have brought up some concept briefly, right? And it's like, oh, I want to shorten this so it doesn't have that. But I still want a little bit of a connection to what I'm going to talk about in something shorter than a sentence. I'm going to add back an adjective or an adverb, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which then has, like, that's problematic for the reasons just
Right.
discussed. And
Right.
so I think some of that was happening as well, where if I had allowed myself a longer total length of text, yeah, it just wouldn't have suffered from me mashing it down, I think.
All right. Well, yeah, I do like concise writing, but like, yeah, if doesn't make it as clear as somebody intended to, yeah, then sure.
I had been in person earlier at Brian Moriarty's lecture at the GDC, The Secret of Psalm 46, which is
Mhm.
one of his more famous lectures.
Mhm.
And if you're curious about that, it exists in its entirety in The Witness.
Oh,
Yes.
spoilers!
Although it's hard to get to. But if you get to it, you get to listen to the whole thing.
Yes. If you're serious about it, you will beat the entire Witness and watch it there.
Yes. If you're a gamer. So one of the things that he was saying
I'm a
in
gamer.
that
I'm a big
speech
boy.
is that like things that are powerful, like things that are fundamental are generous, right?
Mhm.
I'm going to paraphrase really badly because it's
Mhm.
been a while since I listened to it,
Mhm.
but like the world is just generous in there's like a lot of air for you
Mhm.
to breathe,
Mhm.
and there's like a lot of surprise and a lot of and part of what he was expressing in that talk was frustration with sort of the limited thinking of game developers, right? And the way that I make you care about stuff is artificial scarcity,
Mm.
right? Which is weird though, because he's also talking a lot about this masquerade thing, which sort of is artificial scarcity. There's something in that talk that I never fully resolved for myself about exactly what side he was on, right?
Mm.
And this isn't the exact phrase, but he says something like, profound things are generous. The magic is right there.
Yes.
If what people want is invincibility, just give it to them. I really like that speech, and that had been floating around in my head also. Like again, I didn't know how to action that. I mean, obviously you could make a platformer where the character is invincible, but like,
That could
okay,
be a
why
cool
is that
idea.
good?
Right.
Right? And so those were all the seeds of this thing, and they came together at this time.
Like, I'm pretty sure you can think up interesting problems even for invincible character. Like, you're invincible, but you know, you could still be torn apart or held back with something, like be a prisoner. But also it like opens up a whole bunch of other opportunities. Where do I go? Just back? I guess it's the end of this part. Ah. Sneaky. Because usually it's a wall here. Interesting. So it's like a mesh of worlds. Like part of a house and then wherever that is.
So now, when it
The
comes to
bullshit
something
power
like
puzzle.
the World 2 puzzle, I'm playing a little bit of a game with myself there
Okay.
because that isn't about time stuff.
Ooh, I want
Right.
that one next to
To
the
me,
cloud.
it came a little bit later in development after
have to
this
listen
other
to that
pattern was established.
justification.
And so to me, it's a pattern break
Oh.
sequentially in time.
Okay.
Even though to the player it totally isn't.
I see.
And I know that, but there's something, when you work on something for years, you can get really complicated about it. And at some point, I like the weird existential fact that this is a game about us having different experiences sequentially. The chronological sequence to the player is different from the chronological sequence to the designer. And this thing being there early for the player is some vestige of that phenomenon. And
Right.
absolutely nobody is ever going to get that.
Well, if I may,
But I know it.
yeah,
right?
like, is it a little bit like when someone's telling you a story and they say, but I'm getting ahead of myself? Is it kind of like that where it's like, oh, I know all of the stuff because I already know the whole thing I'm telling
I
you.
made this game. I know what
Right,
all
yeah,
the things
yeah.
are.
And so I started to say something that would only really make sense if you also had known the whole thing. And then I'm like, oh, wait, okay, sorry, yeah. So it's this
Yes,
little,
although
it's
usually-
this little thing coming out that's like, well, I already know all this stuff, so trust me, this is interesting. You'll get it in a little bit.
I mean,
or
I think the
whatever.
Princess Bride movie does that, if
Yeah,
I'm remembering
yes,
correctly.
yes.
Yeah, usually that's done, though, in an audience-friendly way.
Right.
I am doing it in an audience-unfriendly
Unfriendly
way.
way, yeah.
So everything that I just said about that is all what I think about it.
Right.
But it also might just be my mind's way of justifying this thing that's cool that I wanted to do.
Right,
And
right,
coming
right.
up with a reason why it's okay.
Right, right.
There is another reason that I think is a little bit similar and may also be slightly a rationalization, which is World 2 is the world where you kind of can't do a lot. It's just rewind.
Hmm.
The other worlds have all these elements of magic that emerge from the rule set.
Right.
And in World 2, there's like no room. There's the initial magic of like, oh, cool, I can rewind.
Right, right.
But on the face of it, there's not room for
Yeah.
phenomenon magic in the same way.
Right.
And so making a hole in it, like poking a hole in that universe through which the magic happens, somehow felt okay. And in fact, if that's going to happen, so that could have been in any world.
Right.
Why is it in World 2?
Right.
Which seems to even be the weirdest place to put it because it's so early in the game.
Right.
And the answer is
That's the only
because World 2 is where it makes the most sense in some way.
Right.
Because World 2 is so
unique
spare
thing that happens in
mechanically,
World 2.
so it has the most conceptual space for it. But also in the other worlds, because they're more complicated, it would be more confusing or
And less special,
something,
yeah.
and less special. Yeah. See, this is the thing that I always try to say to tell people is like, it's good to have reasons about why you do things. But like I said, most of your brain is not the reasoning part.
Right.
And a lot of it has pretty cool ideas. And if you reject them because they don't totally conform to reason, you're maybe not hitting your potential in terms of ideas. Like, what ideas can you bring to bear? However, if you don't apply reason, you're one of these random wacky artists who just is doing wacky things all the time, and that's what makes you creative, is that you're random.
Right, yes.
And that is the kind of person with whom I have fundamental personality conflicts. Like, I don't like that.
Okay.
But I do have a little bit of it, right?
Right,
A little
right.
bit of it.
Right.
As the last little, like, cherry on the cake that's already very good.
Right. So a random cherry on a good cake, on a logical cake, is good. But a logical cherry on a random cake would probably not be.
Yes. Although, logical is maybe not quite the word that I would use.
Coherent
but
or
coherent and
something,
well
yeah.
structured and high quality ingredients.
I think I
and
get
all
what
these
you mean.
things.
I don't know if we've
Yeah.
explained it well, but
No, I think that's good. And I don't think that I've ever explained this particular thing. Like, I've talked to a few people about it, maybe even on
Okay.
the record, but I think what I just said, for anyone listening, is the best explanation that I've ever given of this thing
of that thing. Okay.
to anyone else.
Yeah, the problem with this one, like, I love the idea that you can influence the entities with the puzzle piece. Like, it's pretty fucking cool, and that you eventually figure that out. But yeah, I don't like the puzzle games where you can see the goal, but you have no means to actually proceed. And I feel like the very simple fix to that would be, because you don't get these pieces where the platform is until you move forward and find them and then come back here. But if you put them back, if it was like one of the first things you get, then it's technically possible to solve. Yeah, that's really the only problem with me, is that you can't solve it until you proceed, and that's just not fun, I feel like. Because I would be just wasting a lot of time trying to figure it out, but like it's all hopeless and just a waste. But yeah, the idea is amazing.
This thing that we're talking about, the World 2 thing, is also the biggest mistake in the game.
Ooh,
But not for the reason that we're talking about. And I alluded to this before when
Okay.
we were talking about playtesting, right?
What is the biggest mistake?
The biggest mistake is the following thing.
Okay.
Everywhere in this game,
Mm-hmm.
the first time you see a puzzle, you can solve it.
Okay.
Oh,
And-
there we
And
go.
you don't need to gain extra powers,
Yep.
which you do in other, like if it's Metroid, I need a thing to get up
Very
there,
common.
right?
Very common.
And when people start the game, they don't know that it's not Metroid.
Right.
And so part of what the game is doing is helping you understand that it's not Metroid. Except here. Here, you
But why?
can't solve the puzzle the first time you
Why
get
isn't
there.
it possible?
I
Part
see.
of that had to do with me being afraid in some sense.
Afraid.
Yes, that I would blow the secret and that it would be too easy, because there are 4 puzzle pieces or something that you get in the first couple levels.
Yeah.
And if those had the necessary pieces to solve this, if you got them before you got to the puzzle,
Yeah.
You should have done it.
then you would be able to solve it. But if you have a few pieces and they have this highly visually conspicuous element, there's no camouflage for it.
Right.
You just see it right there. And maybe after doing the witness, I would have had more cojones to like try this,
Yeah.
but I didn't at that time. I was
Okay.
like, it
Hmm.
just seems to me like it's not going to be good, and people are just going to do it, and they're going to see what the thing is, and they're going to do it, and then they're not going to enjoy it because it's just kind of obvious and meh.
I see.
Whereas if you don't know the answer and then you have a bunch of puzzle pieces and there's a bunch of visual information to look at, and then you come back to it and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
right? Then it makes more sense. There's other things like the thing that solves it could have been in one piece, but it's in 2 pieces, right?
Right.
Why because it was just a little too narrow and small in one piece and fiddly.
Right.
And it felt better to me to put the two pieces together and have a big thing. Although programmatically you can solve it with one. Like there is, like
Right.
I make a little platform segment for
Right,
each
right.
one. I've been speaking vaguely as though to avoid spoilers, but like it's not like we've said enough detail to tell you. Like there's an image, there's a table
Yes.
in the image, the painting of the world.
Why are you trying to be vague?
And the
It's commentary.
table looks very, very, very much like one of the platforms that you can stand on, the kind that you can jump
Yes.
up through, but you don't fall through, which is
Yes.
a platformer trope.
Yes.
And so if you realize that, it's really a precursor to the kind of thing that happened in The Witness a lot, right?
Okay.
Even some of the earlier puzzles in The Witness, like there are some trees there and they're conspicuously standing right in front of you and they have information that you want. Spoilers, by the way.
Right,
but
right.
you don't necessarily know that that's where the information is going to come from.
Right.
And part of the magic is that it's right there. So really this was a prototype for a whole game, actually.
Okay.
If you're going to really think about it.
That's a good point.
Maybe the reason why I insisted on putting it in the game and didn't want to drop it is because I felt like there was really a lot possible there and I wanted to like get it going
Dip
a
a
little
toe
bit
in.
mentally. Yeah.
Dip a toe in that particular
Because
pool.
if I threw it away, maybe I would never come back to it,
Right.
you know?
All right. I still think he should have just been more brave, more generous, as in Moriarty's lecture. Because, like, I don't know if I would have figured it out right away, first time playing, there's no way to test it anymore. But I feel like right now it seems very obvious, but I don't know. Like if I can rewatch myself doing it, I probably didn't notice it immediately. It still took me some time. Yeah. I just feel it would have been better without creating this kind of problem with not being able to solve it while having two pieces right here.
Where does this idea come from? Because, yes, like if you go listen to that lecture that you gave, it's very clear that you think that, for example, some of the stuff you do in Braid has these sequence breaks, some things you did in The Witness have these sequence break ideas, and you talk about, if on a Winter's Night, a Traveler potentially having these sequence breaks. Like, you're not sure, but you're like, your interpretation of the book is like, if you look at it this way, there's these possible things where it's like, oh, he sets up something that happens recurringly, and then all of a sudden in one chapter it doesn't happen, you know?
Yeah.
Intentional, unintentional, like what am I reading into, you know, what's going on? And it creates this like interest there. And what I was wondering is that something you're realizing after the fact, or did you realize that in the books at the time and you carried that forward and that's where it comes from in Braid, or is it something totally else? Like, how does this idea arise? Because it's not something that is often talked about elsewhere.
I don't think I ever got it from anyone else. I don't know if anyone else in the games industry has said this kind of thing.
Okay.
But my perception of it is that this is just an idea that I developed on my own.
Okay.
Now, is it influenced by stuff like Calvino and all this stuff? I mean, probably. Like, at the very least, this idea of this abstract, multi-dimensional pattern that we're putting together is certainly influenced by those books because they do that all over the place.
Yeah.
And you could say that that's what I try to do when I do an end game or
see.
something like that, right? An end game is probably a special case of a pattern break that a lot more people are familiar with, right?
This is probably bigger and more important pattern break in a way.
Yes, but I like to play around with it all over the place. You know, another way to think about it that you'll understand, because
Okay.
we've talked about this before,
Okay.
just in terms of like economics and capitalism, right?
Okay.
There's just this phenomenon, right? Where, like, let's say you start a company and you're famous for making high quality things or
Mhm.
whatever, right? You establish this pattern that people associate you with high quality things. And the
Mhm.
thing that inevitably happens is somebody comes along and says, we've stored up a great deal of potential energy,
Hmm.
that we are not exploiting because we're spending all this money on quality, right?
Mhm.
If we stop spending money on quality,
Mhm.
it'll take people a while to figure it out. And in that time, we'll make a bunch of money. And then eventually we'll have depleted our brand value and we'll crater, right?
Okay.
But that like happens with literally everything, intentional or not.
Okay.
That's the pattern.
Okay.
There's establishing this pattern of being something valuable that people want. And then now that there's a bunch of potential energy in there, converting that potential energy to kinetic energy, right?
Okay.
So this is like that. And in fact, it is a little bit similar in that even once you've established a pattern, if you break it a whole bunch after that, you obliterate it.
Right. So in the same way you said, if you completely trash the brand value, then
Yes.
But in this case, you're not trying to trash any value. You're
No,
trying to make it be good.
Yes, I'm
so-
adding to it. But
Yeah.
I'm just trying to tell you like that idea that I have about this thing that happens with brands, I don't know where I picked that up. And I mean, it's obviously something that's true, but like I think about it in this way of like storing potential energy. Like you're building a
Okay.
strong structure
Okay.
that can then withstand you
It-
poking some holes in it.
So if I
Next
then
John
create
Blow's
another
game going to
analogy
be
for
like
this tortured set of
super
analogies we're using.
cheap.
So in some sense, what I hear you saying now is it's almost like building up, you know, it's the ski jumper. If I build up enough speed, I can go off this jump and do a cool trick. I can't keep doing that because I will just crater into the ground. But if I set myself up properly, I can sort of have enough, like, it's almost like design momentum. I can have enough design momentum to carry me through a wilder space that I would not have been able to sustain continuously, but because I'm only going to do it for this trick, and
Yeah.
I've done a good job setting myself up, I can accomplish this thing that's more than what I could have done if that had to be the whole game or something. You have
Yeah.
a pattern momentum that allows you to do something you couldn't otherwise have done on its own.
I mean, I think that analogy makes more sense with regard to Braid and whatever. If you imagine that, like, the ski jump was 95% of it was the downhill part,
Yeah.
and everybody paid attention to the downhill part as
Right.
being, and you did stuff on it,
Slalom, it's slalom
whatever,
for some reason, yeah.
and then you do the jump,
Right. Yeah.
right? But in reality, like the jump is kind of the point, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah, that's
that makes
true.
it a little
Makes it a
different.
worse
I mean,
analogy.
I could imagine a game like that, but I haven't done that game,
Right.
you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't quite get what's going on. Also, I'm thinking like, the cloud is right there, so I could again wait for 2 hours to get to the star place. Would he put a commentary where the star is? Would he do that? I'm not going to be trying to find out on my own for sure. That's way too much time. But there might be some things hidden.
Whereas if they're a little bit different, if they're doing things that are a little bit absurd. So one of the most famous star puzzle, right, that people love to complain about.
I'm sure I know what this one is.
It's the
yeah.
one where you have to ride on a cloud for an hour and a half. Actually, no, that's not correct. You have to wait for a cloud for 45 minutes to get to where you can jump on it. And then you have to ride it for another 45 minutes or
Oh,
so
you can jump from here.
to get to the star.
That's not how I did it.
Not that hard, but it's like pushing at the boundaries of the space in a way that is not totally acceptable in polite company.
Yes.
But like when you're hanging out with your buds, you can do more of that stuff, right?
Sure.
That's it? That's all you have to say about it? Ah, come on. Well, to be fair, the stars are supposed to be like this extra hidden thing, so whatever. I'll maybe try to check if there's any hidden commentary on YouTube. Somebody actually tried going to the cloud. So you have to wait for 45 minutes. Yeah, that's a bit better in terms of reliably getting there, because like here I have no clue how long that will take. And you have to also execute the jump very specifically on Joe here.
So one of the things about the game, we've already said, we want it to feel kind of painterly, kind of analog, expressive. It's not a bunch of tiles. And there are places in the game where you would normally, traditionally, just splat out a bitmap a bunch of times, aside from map tiles. So for example, 2-3 is the monster hunt level, where there's like a HUD on top that says hunt, and there's icons of monsters, and you jump on one and it crosses it out. Most games of that time and earlier, there would just be like a monster HUD bitmap.
I think I already went
and
through
you
this.
just draw those.
Yes.
And in fact, if you look closely at that level, all of the 6 monster icons are different.
Okay.
And all of the X's are different. That.
Yep. All right. Think I did this one. I wish they were like highlighted differently if you did it already. Yeah. Okay, these I can. Oh.
There are 2 parts to the level. There's an above ground part and a below ground part, and they're pretty much separate.
Okay.
So you go to the below ground part, and there's a key that's pretty easy to get.
Right.
And then there are 2 gates, and you have 1 key and 2 gates, and you might think, oh, I need to go look for the other key, but there's no other key on the level. And so you hopefully learn that you can open 2 gates with 1 key by, you know, judicious use of your
pretty
abilities.
easy.
It's not that hard of a puzzle. In fact, you could solve that one accidentally because it's so simple.
Right. And the way that works out is because there are marked, like some of the elements are marked rewind exempt, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then there's a harder puzzle right below that that is a similar situation, but with 3 gates.
Okay.
And so there's a bit of a progression there.
I see.
You know, okay, you get this. Do you get this, which is a more complex version of the same thing.
Right.
But it's certainly not asking you to do the same thing twice.
Right. It's asking you to do a similar thing.
Yes. I mean, the same thing a bunch of times just turns into like Towers of Hanoi or whatever, which is one of the most annoying so-called puzzles in the universe.
Yes.
I mean, it's fine, you know, 2,000 years ago or whenever it was invented for like manipulating blocks, because that's kind of fun, but it's not so fine in a modern video game. There are other ways of obfuscating a puzzle, and obfuscating is maybe not the right word. There are other ways of artfully misdirecting the player away from the trick in a way that's fair and that feels good. And this comes down to the fundamental problem, which is something that I learned probably mainly from designing Braid, and that I went on to think about a lot harder in The Witness, right? But it was this idea of, like, where does magic come from when you're solving a puzzle exactly? Like, sometimes you solve a puzzle and you're like, okay, I figured out the thing to do. And other times you're like, whoa, that was super cool. And in the most extreme of times, which again, I can recommend people Steven's sausage roll for this experience.
The fuck
Sometimes
is that?
if there are few enough things on the level, you can look at the level and say, I know this is impossible.
Yes.
Like the developer is completely trolling me.
Yes.
There is no way to solve this.
Right.
And then you figure out how to solve it. And that is maybe the most magic, because you did the impossible.
Right.
You could explain to somebody why it was impossible. And of course,
Yeah.
there was something about that explanation that was not quite right.
Right.
But you could certainly explain to yourself and maybe to other people, like, clearly this level is not solvable.
Yes.
And so there's a at least one dimension of magic spectrum there, and there probably are multiple.
Right.
And so part of what I was doing over the course of designing Braid was getting a feel for what is more magic and what is less magic.
What was the misdirection exactly? There's 3 doors and 1 key? Or the fact that you need to like you want to jump over this one and you accidentally get the key? No, it doesn't even happen. Alright.
Okay, so another thing that I implemented and was in one of the versions of the game, although probably not in the very first one. You know, again, thinking about the physics basis of the game originally, what are some things about physics at a small scale? Well, things are quantized.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff about that with like the speed of light moving like in increments or something.
Or like black
yeah.
body radiation,
Yeah.
for example, being only solvable. Like that's how quantum mechanics was discovered, was like if you try to solve the equations for when things get hot, what wavelengths should they emit and how
Okay.
much? It was like nonsensical and didn't match measurements,
Okay.
right? And then to match measurements, it turns out like, oh, if you can only give off photons at certain discrete energy levels, then this all works out. And that's actually how they started looking at quantum mechanics.
Which
right?
is mildly terrifying because you don't normally think of things in the real world as being quantized. But-
yeah, but they are.
but
They
off we
totally
go.
are, right?
Okay.
So,
God ran out of bits, I guess.
and I don't think that's what happened. But anyway, so
So there's a mechanic based on this quantization?
what
Or
if,
was
since
the
the
mechanic?
game is about time now,
Yeah.
then the quantization would affect time. And so what I implemented was, again, time, the whole game is paused.
Okay.
And then instead of, you know how you use the arrow keys and you have the jump button, right?
Yes.
Instead of those being continuous inputs, you get this little like control HUD that pops up over your guy that has like the 4 arrows and the jump button.
Oh, I remember this.
And then you hold them down because you might want to go
Yes.
diagonal or something.
Yes.
If you just want to go forward, you tap forward and release it, and your guy goes a certain amount, running the continuous simulation for a fixed amount of
I
time.
see.
Right. If you wanted to go diagonal and jump, you hit all 3 of those and then release them, and he does that.
I see.
right?
So you kind of, it's like a turn-based braid.
Turn-based, but with the same simulation underneath, because
Right.
I mean, you could invent in a whole entire turn-based version of the game, and some
Right.
people might do that, but
Right.
it didn't seem along the lines of what I wanted to do.
Okay.
Like, this wasn't a game where you go into totally different simulators in every world. It was a game where
Right.
it's the same one, but it's modified.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did that, and again, I had trouble coming up with puzzles and controlling situations to make them interesting. And it was just this mode of having a discrete time step that then played out in a simulation. It was pretty sloppy, and it was hard to even think about what was going to happen. Like, what's a typical thing that happens in this game? Well, there's a monster, maybe he's walking away from you toward a wall and he's going to bounce off, and then you want to jump on him.
Right.
And in continuous mode, in the beginning, that might be hard to learn, like when to jump and how, if you want to bounce
Right.
off him.
Right.
Right. In this mode, it was way even more awkward to
Right.
learn.
Right.
And the end result just wasn't good. Like,
Right.
okay, I'm doing this interaction and that's cool, but I'm not getting more out of the interaction than I put in.
All right. In the prototype, there was a level where time was mapped to the vertical dimension. Huh. Yeah, I don't know how that would work. Show me.
With regard to how did I come up with the different worlds, I just had ideas.
Mhm.
And of course, I would have an initial guess about whether this was a good idea.
Right.
And some ideas
Won't be
are
super hard to
interesting,
program.
but seem like they're going to hit a brick wall really fast. Some ideas sound cool as a high level idea, but I couldn't even find a way to make it actionable, like a mechanic again, right?
Can you give any examples? Do you remember any of these ideas that basically
Um,
got tabled because they didn't work out?
Well, I could start by talking about ones that I actually implemented.
Okay.
Well, there's two. So you already mentioned the T equals Y, right?
Right.
Which is mildly different from T equals X, right? It's the same implementation detail technically. It's like you
Yes.
just decide the other axis is
Yes.
controlling the thing. And interactively, it's a little bit different because it's cute that, you jump. And so jumping has an up part and a down part. So a jump automatically has a forward in time and a backward in time piece,
Yes.
right? Now, the thing is, the jumps are pretty short in the game. They're like much shorter than Mario jumps for reasons.
Okay.
That with the other objects in the game, so the primary other object I'm looking at, so the level that was in the early version of the game was the little monster guys being shot out of cannons, right?
Yes.
And because if they're walking very slowly, in the amount of time that a jump takes, they don't go very far. And so they'll
Right.
go forward and back, but there's just not much of a state change that happens there, right? On the other hand, if I shot them out of cannons, if the velocity is really fast that they get shot at,
Yeah.
then they'll change appreciably over a time frame like that.
Right.
But then it becomes kind of hostile to play. And so this one level that
Okay.
I made was you're climbing up a trellis and there's cannons shooting across it, and you're sort of trying to navigate around, find the path up that will not result in you being beamed, right? Which is in some sense a static solution for that exists, because at any y coordinate there will be monsters at any xy coordinate, right?
Right.
And I didn't have a lot of other ideas for it.
Right.
And also, the general tenor of the rest of the game is the levels are horizontal and they're a little bit vertical enough to make interesting situations. And suddenly, when t equals y, it's like, well, you end up with levels that are probably really tall,
Okay.
or at least levels where you go up to the top and all the way back down and up to the top and all the way back down.
Right.
I was just thinking about what are the possibilities there. And I never came up with anything like there's always this thing where you start with an idea and it's not working out that well. But maybe if you get over some hump and find a few things, it'll click better, right? It's like two atoms forming a molecule. It's like maybe they repel each other,
Yeah.
but then you get them into the correct energy well and they'll like
Right.
snap into an equilibrium, right?
Right.
Sometimes design is like
like
that.
his
And
metaphors
for that
just
thing, I
goes
just
into
didn't ever find it. And so then
Okay.
there was still the
elemental
idea
particles and
I could
quantum
keep
physics.
it in the t equals x world
Ah.
just as an ending thing, like a little punctuation on the end, like a surprise. But the other worlds don't have something like that, and
Okay.
it just wasn't that good in
Okay.
the end,
Okay.
right? So yeah, I didn't. And also, like some of the other monsters,
Would be cool to
there's
see that
almost no
world.
interaction with at all. Like in the very beginning of the game, I don't think there were the plant monsters that go up and down.
Mm-hmm.
But those were added not too long after, I don't think.
Right.
And unless I made horizontal ones,
Right. Right.
there's almost no interaction you can have
Right.
between climbing upward and
Yeah.
avoiding those monster guys. I
Yeah.
mean, it could be that they would kill or don't kill like other monsters, but that's
Right.
also kind of statically determined and uninteresting.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, it just wasn't good,
Right. Right.
And I saw that relatively quickly. Although that said, it's possible that I missed something, right? And there would have been something cool there. World 4 is time is tied to space. In fact, I think it was t equals x and then t equals y, which there's no t equals y in the final game.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
But how did you have that idea? Or
It was this physics initial idea. And so once I realize, okay, there's rewind in this game, it's working well. How do I tie in the other physics ideas? Because there's maybe supposed to be quantum mechanics and relativity and whatever. And
Right.
well, what is there about relativity? Like, there's 4 dimensions, right? And like time is a dimension. Can I put that in this game somehow? And does that involve rewind in some way?
I see.
And, regular space time for us is like 3 plus 1 before you
Right.
start talking about string theory or whatever.
Right.
This game is 2 dimensions. So, like, how do I is it 2 plus 1? And just somehow it just maps onto the idea of like, what if I just controlled time by your position, right?
Right.
It's just the idea popped up. What can I say? Like those were the inputs, and in this concrete case, it was not very hard to have the idea. Let's just map it to space because that'll be cool. It's again, I start thinking about what that is before I implement it, and it's like, oh, it'll be kind of neat that you're kind of in control of the motion of the world, and if you stop, everything stops. Like, before I try to make puzzles with that, it's got an interesting feel and an interesting kind of interactivity, right? And then I think, how would I implement it? And it's like, well, it's pretty easy to look at like where is the player spawn in the very initial implementation, maybe even in the final thing. Your spawn point is just like the leftmost part of the level.
Mhm.
So there's no question about, could I go earlier in time than when I spawned in?
Right.
So you just literally load the level and then you simulate it forward. And then instead of just the rewind key, you have an alternate input that's, if you walk left, rewind the rewind buffer by that amount, right?
Right.
And that's very easy to think of implementation wise. And you could kind of hack it in and like, well, if there's some robustness issues with this or whatever, we'll think about it later, right?
But it can't quite rewind the rewind buffer, can it? Because isn't the way that works in Braid that you can also rewind?
Yes.
So it can't quite
Extra.
rewind the rewind buffer in the way that the rewind buffer
Well,
normally gets rewound, because it needs to be putting that action also onto the rewind
Yes.
buffer.
So it's a
right?
little bit different. It's like,
You might look at the rewind buffer and apply it or something?
yes,
Okay.
it's seek to the time indicated by
Right.
the leftward travel,
Right.
round to the nearest frame,
Yep.
right? Take that state and then forward diff the current state to that,
Right.
right? And that's the new rewind frame. So
Right.
it is not trivial, but if your code is not a flaming nightmare, it
Right.
doesn't take that long.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially if you're not worried. I'm sure the rewind buffer was just a flat array at that time or whatever.
Right,
Of
yeah.
each frame is a thing, and then there's probably a data structure for each frame. It wasn't that sophisticated, but I don't care, right? There's not that many objects in this game. It's a proof
Right,
of concept. It's all
right,
good.
right.
Yeah. With regard to how did I come up with the different worlds, I just had ideas.
Mhm.
And of course, I would have an initial guess about whether this was a good idea.
Yeah, pretty sure I was here. Yeah. The idea of the time slowdown ring.
And then World 6, again, came from these physics ideas. It's like, okay, relativity.
Mm-hmm.
You have this time dilation thing.
Mm-hmm.
What if I just, not trying to make it be about speed of light or anything
Mhm.
directly,
It's
but
like gravity.
let's just put time dilation in and just see how that goes. And I wasn't sure at first if that was going to generate enough interesting situations.
Right.
And it turns out to have, although it is mostly kind of binary, right? It's like, well, I want something to go slow is the way that it gets used.
Right.
But that's actually mostly fine. And there are nuances to some of the levels that make it more like the analog part of it comes into play a little bit more. And so the initial implementation, so if you're thinking about, okay, what would this actually be?
Yeah.
It's like, well, you're dropping a singularity somewhere where things are totally frozen somehow at that point. And then maybe we add a little bit of a fudge factor so that you don't walk into that point and then your
then you're
game is
stuck.
over,
Yeah.
right? So one of the problems is with the rate itself. Like
Okay.
going way down towards zero, it's not that fun to try and play. Like requiring that is weird.
Because the player just kind of moves too slow through there, and it's
Yeah, everything. Like
Yeah.
if anything going through there is so slow
Yeah.
that it's not fun to wait for it, or
right.
and to require that in a solution wouldn't be that fun.
Right.
Also, even before implementing this, I knew like, hey, the music and stuff sounds go backward when you rewind. They should slow down appropriately when you're in this thing. And I already could picture in my mind what that would feel like. Like you
Yeah.
would go into the music and it's like,
Yeah.
right? Now, O.2, which is the current factor that I chose, is about the place at which you can still kind of hear the music,
Okay.
but it's pretty slow.
Okay.
Like if you slow things down much further than that, the sonic energy is like so slow that you don't even hear anything coherent. And you also, it would be one thing if you were, I don't know, holding the ring in your hand constantly the way you hold a key and moving around. Because then you could like find the spot that does what you want, but it's
Right.
not like that. It's like you drop it and it's on, and now you
Yep.
pick it up. And maybe I could have tried more of the other thing, but that seemed bad because you would be walking around in the slow thing 100% of the time. It's like it
Well, based on all the things you're saying, I kind
Yeah.
of have, I think, what I assume the obvious question that anyone would have at this point is, why slowing down? Why not speeding up?
I think I just like the slowing down.
Okay, it just aesthetically speaking, you like things going in and going. "Whoa."
Yeah, but also there's a reason to bias things in that direction, which is again, so it's a puzzle game, most of which you have tuned to be playable at 1.0, right?
Right.
If things get slower than 1.0, it's playable
right.
mostly. It's just,
Right.
slower. If things get a lot faster than 1.0, maybe it's not playable anymore. Like if you're trying to jump on
Right.
a monster, like if you're jumping on monsters at O.2, it becomes a really different experience, right?
Yep.
If you're trying to jump on monsters at 5.0, like that's unplayable.
Right.
Now, that said, I never explored. That's the reasoning, or some of the reasoning, right? I never actually went and explored that. And sometimes you
Right.
do it and you find that there's something you didn't think of. Or
Right.
whatever,
Right. But this one worked, so
it was
wasn't
fun. I
necessary.
started
Yeah.
doing it and I found it was cool and there was enough to do with it, right?
In a Time magazine article, they quoted you as saying the following: I've been interested for a long time in what kinds of communication are possible. Are there other forms of communication that we can refine in the way that we've refined language? And it's almost an experiment going on that you're doing where you're like, how much can I communicate without directly talking at you? Like what sorts of things can I create in a game before English gets deployed, right?
Yes.
Like, did you want to say anything sort of big picture about that to go with all the things you said, which are kind of all about that in a way?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely an idea that I got a glimmer of during Braid.
Mm-hmm.
The Witness is like a lot about this, right?
Right.
But going back to Braid, it's like I was learning it and playing with it a little bit. And one of the standout examples for me, and it's probably going to be hard to explain. Like it's going to seem like a small thing, right?
Well,
But there's a level in World 5, which is the alternate universe one, where you need to get a key across a pit,
mm-hmm.
right? And the original version of this level was different from how it is now. The original version of the level was maybe, like we were saying before, a little too obvious.
Okay.
The way in which it was a little too obvious was, the idea was I wanted a key shared between universes because one of the things that could happen is one instance of you could transfer it to another instance of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in the original version of this level, you would go over. So if you're going to pass the key from one instance to another of the guy, there sort of has to be a reason why that guy just can't do the thing that you were going to do, right?
Okay.
Let's just say it's a key that opens a gate that's on the left. Even if that gate isn't shared in the universes, if he walks over there and opens it, and then you rewind, and that key's not rewind exempt. Now he's going to walk over there and open it, and he's not shared between universes, but the key is, so it'll open the gate in your universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in order to make this idea work, there has to be some constraint that the Shadow Universe guy just cannot go to the target position for whatever reason.
Okay.
So my original idea was, well, you just sort of fall down a thing that's too high to go back up, and there's like a hole, like the Count of Monte Cristo or something, that you put the key through, right?
The Count of Monte. I don't think I know. I mean, I know vaguely the reference.
But
it's
I'm
a
thinking
famous
of this.
book, but
again, it's a little bit of a Calvino reference because he has his own Count of Monte Cristo take.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
All right.
That works
Mm-hmm.
because the guy can't go through the hole in the wall. But holes in the wall do not happen that often, right? Like sometimes I had already been putting them as, there are holes that the monster can fit in. They're little monster tunnels where we would put a key or something, right? And I might put a little lip on it just to help emphasize the fact that the player can't go in there, even though without the lip
only.
doesn't do anything. Yes.
No Tims allowed.
Yes. So I designed this and it worked mechanically, but it did exactly what I was saying before, which is it's too frickin' obvious.
Right.
Now, one way to make it less frickin' obvious is there's a whole bunch of these weird holes in the walls. Like he's in the mail room of a large corporation now.
Right,
there's just
yes.
mail slots in all the doors.
Yes,
I don't know, right?
Yes. You could have made it a more standard environmental feature everywhere, but then it begs the question why.
That makes the whole game noisy,
Exactly.
right? That's not very good.
Yeah.
Just for one puzzle, no.
Yeah.
Right? But the other thing you can do is think, how can I achieve this via other elements? And what I came up with was, okay, instead of just a wall there's a pit, and we can even add a little bit of a verticality to the two sides of the pit to make it even more clear that you just can't really jump out from the right going to the left. You're just gonna die. Right? It used to be this guy's just sort of standing somewhere and pushing the key through the mail slot, right? Now he has to jump into spikes and kill himself.
Right.
To hand me the key, right?
Yeah.
What
And
is the sword?
that's me, and I just did intentionally do it.
He's sort of a martyr.
And he's gonna go away anyway, but it's weird, and it's in this strange space that I was aiming for, but it's very dramatic in a way that a lot of things in the game aren't.
Yeah.
So that was also good. That was a reason why I like that version of the level.
Interesting.
All right. That's nice. So this is the original.
This is the first version of the key passing puzzle that I thought of and implemented in the game. It's simple, and it doesn't require the somewhat precise jumping of the final version. Instead, you just pass the key through the little hole in the wall. But I didn't like it because it seems so obvious and contrived. Obvious because the hole grabs so much attention. I need to get this key from one side of the wall to the other, and what else would such a hole be for? When you solve the puzzle, it can't really feel magical because obviously that weird hole is there so you could put the key through it. Whereas there are spike pits elsewhere in the game, so that pit's very existence didn't raise attention. That it seemed too contrived is a bit of a different thing than being obvious, but it's not totally unrelated. Because there are no small holes in thin walls elsewhere in the game, it's like we're adding a new concept into the level geometry that the player needs to recognize, but just for this puzzle, and we'll never see it elsewhere. I try to avoid this kind of thing in my designs because when you do this a lot, it makes the game feel weighted down and ugly.
Why the hell the key went back? Oh shit. Okay, this is a new mechanic that resets where the keys are? Or it's just to show you the design, you don't actually open up anything. Okay. Never mind.
This is the version of the puzzle that's present in the released game, but the solution is even more obvious here because the key is in a small area with a wall to the right, so the only possible way the key could go is to the left. In the actual game, the key is located next to the rabbit distraction puzzle where you can keep running to the right a little bit, and I did this intentionally to create a little more uncertainty about where to go with the key. You solve this puzzle by jumping across the pit so that the key almost makes it to the other side, but then you rewind and let your shadow do the jump while you stand in the proper place to receive the key. To solve the puzzle, you have to start your jump very close to the edge of the platform, which is a negative to me. I would like it if the puzzle gave you a lot more slack in terms of where to jump, which is part of a philosophy discussed over here. But if you as the designer size the pit so that the player can successfully jump from further back, then a more experienced player could instead run up to the very edge and jump and make it across the pit alive, which ruins the entire puzzle. So the pit cannot be very narrow. But even with a pit that you can't jump across, we still have the problem that because the key has to get far enough that you can grab it later, you have to be able to almost jump across. And this violates one of the core principles of puzzle design we mentioned in the link above, which is that if you aren't supposed to be able to jump across a gap, it should be clear that you can't do it to avoid player fumbling and frustration. You shouldn't even come close to making that jump, but you have to for the puzzle to work. To help mitigate this situation, I made the left side of the pit higher than the right. Now, when you attempt to jump, at the far side your feet are well below where they need to be to successfully land, so it's more clear that you just can't do it. But because the key is held higher than foot level, it still ends up in a good place. But I can't make the left side too high, otherwise it lets the player jump from the left to the right, which I also didn't want, because this makes the solution a little too obvious or trivial feeling. After all, if you just jumped over the pit to grab the key, of course you're going to try to jump right back. Also, in order for the puzzle to work well, when you do it wrong and jump into the pit and die, the key needs to fall to a position where the live player can no longer reach it. Otherwise, the timing element of the puzzle would be gone because you could grab the key anytime after the shadow jumps into the spikes. Getting the key more easily would not only make the puzzle less interesting to solve, it would sap drama and gravitas, because these are much stronger when the about-to-die Tim desperately passes the key to the alive Tim. In order for this key passing to work at all, a rule had to be specified in the gameplay code. If the Shadow Tim is holding a key that's shared among both realities, and the live Tim intersects with that key, the live Tim takes possession from the Shadow Tim. Because the game is a simulation that should respond deterministically to all events that could happen in its world, the game must have some consistent rule about what happens in this case, but as the designer, you get to decide what that rule is. Maybe a more natural rule would be that whoever was already holding the key keeps it. But I wanted this specific puzzle to work, so I made the rule the way it is now. You could think of this extra rule as being a tiny blemish on the puzzle design, but given that the active reality already feels more important than the shadow reality, this rule may seem unsurprising to the player if he thinks clearly about it at all, which most players won't.
Yeah, I thought about it, but it wasn't established as a rule, and it was kind of felt unfair. Because you can't really figure it out. Because it kind of, like, the way I figured it out was a bit random. Because I was trying to catch the key, basically as the character was dying, which makes no sense, but like that was the logic behind how to solve it. And I'm sure like a lot of other people also tried to do the same thing, but eventually accidentally grabbed the key while doing so.
Here we show various versions of the key passing puzzle so we can contrast them.
Why is this one here? This is not where it begins. Wait, what? Why is it here? Did I read this one? Oh my god.
The idea for this level is that you need to bounce off this monster's head in order to get across this gap, but you probably killed the monster on the way up. So by the time you get to this platform here and can't figure out a way up, there is no longer a monster down there that you can see as a clue to what you should do. so the jump just seems plainly impossible. Suppose we're designing this level. How wide should we make this gap? This is an important decision with lots of nuances. Obviously, the gap needs to be wider than you can get just by jumping, because if it isn't, you can just jump across so there's no puzzle. How much wider should it be? One answer is barely wider so that it feels like you could almost jump across but can't quite. You might imagine this to be a way of teasing the player, like, oh, you're so close. But there are problems with doing this. Firstly, as a designer, you have to always keep in mind that players don't know what you know. They're always at least a little more confused about everything. When they get to a level like this, they're not even sure there is a puzzle. If you give them a jump that they could almost make, the player's confusion is not going to be, aha, I cannot make the jump. This is a puzzle where I must figure out some other way across. Much more likely, he'll think, I almost made it. Maybe I jumped too early off that platform. Maybe if I run to the very edge and jump at the very last instant, I might be able to make it. And then this doesn't work, but the player knows his timing might still have been off, and this is an earlier level in the game, so he isn't super familiar with the timings and distances yet. So he'll try again and again, and maybe each try will take longer than you want, because even though rewind is in the game, it is quite common for people missing this jump to run all the way back to the left, climb the ladder, run to the right, and try again, because they aren't used to using rewind to correct non-deadly mistakes. So there would be some tedious attempts, and then the player is getting frustrated before starting to take seriously that there may be some other way to do it, and this starts things off on the wrong foot emotionally. Instead of a narrow gap, you might go for a super wide gap. Make the gap the maximum length you could travel by bouncing off the monster's head. You might think this would be good, because upon first sight, the player knows he just isn't going to jump that gap normally. Or even if he makes one jump attempt, that is certainly enough. He didn't come anywhere close to making it. So he won't have this frustrating experience of trying repeatedly that we just described. But maybe too much certainty is bad. There's not a whole lot you can do in this game, so maybe we're making the puzzle too obvious if the player knows on first sight he absolutely cannot jump that gap. Maybe the wide gap will attract so much attention that he will see the problem earlier, maybe much earlier, before he kills the important monster. But a bigger problem with a maximum wide gap is execution skill. Ignoring any idea of trying to get up to the ledge, it's already a bit hard just to jump down and hit the moving monster below. If the gap is extremely wide, you would need to perform that bounce when the monster is at exactly the maximal extent of your jump, which greatly limits the range of situations in which you can be successful, and timing must be very, very precise. You'd end up in a situation where a lot of players might be trying the right solution, but still miss the jump by quite a lot. What happens then? Remember, the player always knows much less than you do. He may conclude that this isn't the solution either, and then try to think of something else, and when no better idea comes, he may give up, because failure here looks a lot like failure in the case of, say, horizontally jumping with no monster. He just didn't succeed in getting onto the far ledge, but there's no real clarity of what went wrong, since the right answer is a mystery. Even if the player doesn't discount this solution, you've still made success in the puzzle highly contingent upon mastery of running and jumping, and tedious use of rewind to try again and again. And is this really what the game is about? What experience do you really want players to have? At the start of development, I didn't have a clear picture of all this, but as I worked on levels, I formulated clearly the idea that I want puzzles to be solvable mainly by understanding the core idea, with execution being relatively easy once you had that idea. And once you have the idea, you should know that the idea is right and not be confused about it. This is easier said than done. Because the game is based on action mechanics, sometimes it is hard to tune things to meet this ideal. But I tried, and this puzzle is one example. I sized this platform wide enough that you clearly can't make it in one jump, but close enough that very sloppy execution of a monster bounce is good enough. But this gap being on the shorter side of the spectrum between the two possibilities, I do think sometimes players jump repeatedly to try and cross it because it is not so wide as to dispel all doubt immediately. So maybe it should have been a little bit wider.
Yeah, he speaks about such simple thing for so long. I don't know. This is a bit too much. On the other hand, like I feel like he also created these commentaries more for game designers. It's like some sort of a lecture on how to do game dev. It's useful to know, but I don't know. It's something that seems too obvious to me, but also maybe because it's already been done. Like if you get to actually developing games, you might make these mistakes, even if you think you wouldn't. I don't know. I don't think I'm supposed to be here again.
Here's a version of key passing where you can give the key to a monster who takes it through the tunnel for you.
But I
This
don't
is
usually
less
take
weird than the previous
keys.
version because such monster tunnels already exist throughout the game.
How to die?
This version of the puzzle seems too easy to solve by mistake, though. If your shadow is holding the key and accidentally gets killed by the monster, the key will naturally end up on the other side of the tunnel without you intending that to happen at all. When the player experiences an accidental puzzle solve, it can confuse him and reduce his confidence that the makers of the game have him in good hands, which can have consequences down the road. To decrease the odds of an accidental solve, here I've put extra monsters atop the various platforms to help put the player in the mood to stomp monsters. Because if the player casually stomps the monster that would have been the one going through the tunnel, obviously an accidental solve will not happen. The extra monsters also make the solution less of a blatant giveaway. It's not, hey, here is just one monster walking through this tunnel, it must be the answer. Another positive aspect is that this version gets rid of the special rule: if the shadow is carrying the key and the active player touches it, he takes the key away from the shadow.
Wait, I can't actually solve this. What am I supposed to do? Because if I die, I get the key back. But if I do the shadow doesn't have a key. Huh? Oh wait, maybe no. Oh. So if he picks it up, he has the key. Okay. There's so much commentary, man. Did I do? I don't know which I did, which I didn't. 2 more, so these. So puzzle pieces, is it ideas or game design? What is this?
Already there's an interesting question, like a game mechanics question or a programming question, like if both of you are overlapping the key, who actually gets it?
Yeah.
And I prioritized like, okay, the newest instance, which is always the one that you're live playing, gets it, right? But that doesn't have to be the rule. That's one of those rules that you make up. That's a second order thing that fills in and helps make sense of, or helps instantiate the more general rule about keys could be shared between universes or whatever.
Right. Because somebody has to, when we don't know from some grand scheme what the rule should be, someone has to make, the designer has to make up what the rule is that fills in the gap.
Yeah, and there's a lot of art to making that decision correctly, because you can come up with a very uninteresting game by making that decision wrong.
Right.
most of the levels, you go into them, and there's a name for the level, and it comes up on the screen, and it kind of tells you what the level's about, but not really in a spoilery way,
Right.
hopefully. For this level, I was like, what name do I put there? That kind of doesn't spoil this thing.
I see.
Like, if you called it Handoff or something,
Right.
that gets, maybe people don't know exactly what that means, but you're going to kind of spoil the idea.
Or sacrifice, similarly.
Sacrifice would be the sacrifice of Isaac. Yeah.
You kind of know that, like, okay, one of my guys probably gets killed in the spikes here.
And you ruined the feeling and the
I
surprise.
don't
and,
think
like, the
people
gut
would
clench that
figure it
happens.
out based on
And so I
just
was like,
title.
oh, well, this is also a place where I can break the pattern.
Mhm.
So I break the pattern here, and well,
Maybe
there's two things
some,
that
but-
happen, right? The level fades in. There's an icon,
Like
representing the
90%
level,
one.
Mhm.
and then there's a name.
Mhm.
And for this level, there's an icon which just illustrates somebody standing next to a pit with a key
Mhm.
and no name.
Mhm.
And that felt to me like a good place to put it, because the fact that there's no name before you even go into the level is communication, because we broke the sequence.
Mhm.
You notice
But,
that,
like,
hopefully,
I
unless you're just
thought
sleepwalking
it's
through
part of
game,
the
and you're like,
story.
that's weird.
Mhm.
Not part of the like
What?
mechanics.
And you're like, okay, I'm going to tread carefully for a little bit. Like, the human mind just has this in it, right? Like, I'm going to tread carefully for a little bit because I don't
Like
know.
I noticed that it
What's going on here?
I don't know exactly
tied
what's going
to the
on. Something
levels.
changed, right? And so that's what that is. It's a little signal that this is an area of a little bit more tension or a little bit more drama or something, right? But also, you get to decide that. Like, I don't play music to make you feel a certain way. I mean,
Right.
apart from the music that's already in the game, I don't go dun 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 as
Yeah.
the thing fades
Or
in
like
or whatever.
tense violins.
No.
Mm.
In fact, it's a small change,
Right.
and it's not linguistic. In fact, we take away the language.
Yeah.
It's more like body language or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? It's the body language of the game is
Right.
like suddenly the game feels a little bit strange about something and isn't saying hi to you
Right.
in the morning when it
Yeah.
normally would.
Okay.
And it's like, wait,
It's passive aggressive.
did I not
game.
do the dishes last night? Like, what?
Yeah.
Why is this?
Right.
And that's one of the examples that stands out the most in my mind in the game. It's one of my favorite examples. It's subtle enough that, again, I'm not sure a lot of people think much about it consciously, because that fade in only lasts a couple of seconds. And then probably
Yeah.
what most people remember is the actual level that comes after. But the thing to realize is how that level is received. The part that people remember, their experience there depends on the initial conditions,
Right.
right? Even if they forget the initial conditions.
Right, yeah.
And so initial conditions are important.
Yeah, it wasn't like a big thing for me, because I never treat like a second version, a shadow version, as somebody else. It's just me backwards in time. Like, it's not really a sacrifice because I'm still here. So yeah, it's not it's not a tragedy for me. It's like another Souls puzzle. I didn't really read too much into it. Yeah, it's like, how can you possibly fucking tell anything from this? I don't know if there are really new levels, because like I won't count like the original levels as really like levels. I mean, it's nice to see some concepts, but they haven't been designed as well as the original. I would really love to like see some new levels that John Blom designed. Like if he got some new ideas that he wanted to do something with different rule sets, but just couldn't fit it in. That would be nice to play. But yeah, I mean, it's nice to have them, but this goddamn promise about, what was it, 40 new levels, 35 new levels, kind of feeling betrayed a bit about that. All right, well, gotta go now. Gotta go to sleep. I wish I could play more, or we're more of a passive player now. Yeah. Interesting.